Welcome to Financial Fridays. Today we're joined by Felix Partners, Mr. Sasha Savick. Sasha is a senior tax and finance leader with Felix Partners. And today we're going to talk about trade winds and trade winds shifting, the tariffs and their reach to Australia. I mean, Sasha, we've been, as you know, as the world knows, we're the trade practices that we're normally used to has been really disrupted by the United States and Liberation Day laid out by Mr. President Donald Trump and his trade war or tariff war. What does that mean for Australia? What does this mean for us, these tariffs? I know there was 25% tariffs on the aluminium and steel, and then there's a overall blanket 10%. What does that mean for Australian businesses?
Good to have you back again, Donald. And really looking forward to talking about tariffs this morning. It's a topic on everyone's lips. Everyone wants to know more. At the moment, it's super uncertain, but we'll try and unravel and unpack a lot of that over the next 10 minutes or so. So I'll maybe take a step back. So over the last, say, 100 or so years, we've gradually gone from era of protectionism, where we've had really high tariffs back in the 1900s when trade was just starting to emerge between different economies, era of protectionism. And then we've had a couple of other spikes along the way, but generally we've moved in one direction, that is to achieve very low tariffs in a global economy. What we've seen since 2016, when Donald Trump got first elected, is the emergence of this protectionism and emergence of tariffs. And we've seen that again in 2025. So that's created a lot of uncertainty. As you know, as your audience has heard, we had the so-called Liberation Day. We've had turmoil in the stock markets. The key point here is we still don't know where it's at. We've had attempts to reset. We've had attempts to push the boundaries really high as far as tariffs go, but we don't know where that's going to land. I think that's going to be a prolonged negotiation process, and certainly that's sparked a lot of different trade winds and shifts in the global supply chains. It's created a ripple effect.
Yes.
Because once you start introducing these tariffs between Australia and the US and China and so forth, it does tend to have a ripple effect. And an example is tariffs on Chinese imports from the US, like steel and aluminium and other products, can have a ripple effect onto Australia, because those goods then get produced in China, they get imported by Australia, they cost more. So it's not one way; it's a multifaceted ripple effect that takes place.
Well, I know that a lot of folks just because I'm an American, people often think, oh, he's an American, he was in politics in America, that I would automatically know everything. Well, I don't. I live in Australia now, but I do stay in tune with conversations with my colleagues back in the United States. And as you say, it's still uncertain, even if you're in government, even if you're on the state level making policy. And I would argue that even federal congressmen and U.S. senators are still a bit uncertain about what the president will do next. And I think that uncertainty in the market is driving financial markets across the world to look at different ways in which they play. For a company looking at alternatives, is this a good opportunity to start exploring different markets? What's the upside of these trades?
Yeah, look, diversification of trade is the key here for companies. What we've learned from more recent examples prior to these announcements, say going back to 2017, 18, when all this started, is that by diversifying your export markets, you can actually mitigate a lot of those risks. You can't fully mitigate them because it's the whole global economy that's embroiled at the moment. But what Australia has learned, for example, is that when we had imposition of tariffs a number of years ago by the US to China, Australia reacted by putting, by putting their own tariffs to Australia. So, for example, our wine exports were severely impacted. So we know from actual examples that when you raise tariffs that high, in that case, China raised the tariffs on our wine exports, those exports were as high, those exports essentially can stop or they're reduced in that instance by up to 90%.
Yeah.
So what Australia did in that instance is they diversified its exports to other markets. So that's really one element of staying on top of it. The other is just keeping in the loop on what's going on. So for example, with the current set of announcements, we've got a 90-day pause, which has been announced by the Trump administration, and that 90-day pause will allow for some negotiations to take place. We simply don't know yet what's going to essentially emanate from all of that. What we do know is that tariffs as high as 145% are probably not realistic.
They're not realistic.
Yeah. So we know that actually equates to a trade embargo. So we know that common sense needs to prevail, and we need to actually arrive at a level that is sustainable between the economies. But what we also know is that we're probably not going to go back to the levels that we've seen prior to the most recent.
Well, I often equate it as a tax increase. When you're looking at passing legislation and the cost of education increases, the cost of groceries increase, so there's usually a blanket tax increase. I know we've had a tax increase here in Australia. I know when we're paying superannuation, it's gone from 10% now, I think it's 11.5% in superannuation. So it's one of those increases in taxes. So I would look at, from a global standpoint, the U.S. has technically increased taxes by 10% on the tariffs, kind of. But in terms of those tariff increases, this tariff war, a lot of Americans are listening to our conversation. Who's hardest hit by these increases in tariffs? Who ultimately has to pay the big bill?
Yeah, look, it's a really good question, and there's two different ways you can look at that. One thing we do know, when the tariff is imposed, tariff needs to be paid into the US government coffers, right? So when a good comes imported from China or anywhere else for that matter, it's subject to an additional impost. So if something costs $100, if we've got a tariff of say 70 or 80%, that means an additional $80 goes into the US coffers. Now, that same importer who's taken the goods in has to then place those goods into the market, right? So he has a decision to make. He can either absorb some of those costs or he can pass them on. If he decides to pass them on, which is that option A that you alluded to, which is the increases that we're seeing, then that's going to create significant cost increases across the board. It's inflationary. It could actually have a counterproductive effect on interest rates, etc. Again, I'm not an expert in that field, but that's kind of like, if you follow the broader economic logic, is what could happen. The other option is that some of it gets absorbed, and they absorb it in the margin. Now, how do you absorb an 80% tariff in the margin? You probably can't. So going back to my earlier point, really the key to this is to come to the negotiating table and negotiate something that's essentially sustainable for both parties.
Absolutely. And what are some of the tax implications on a business as it relates to these tariffs? Is there a way to offset some of their tax obligations to the ATO, for instance, because of a increase in tariffs? What is it for a business? Benefits for business? Are there any benefits, or is it strictly deficit? Is it pain and no relief?
Look, so let's use a hypothetical example here. So if an Australian importer brings in goods and they've got to pay additional tariff as a result of the two countries agreeing on a tariff, say 20-30%, that money has to go straight into the government treasury coffers through Australian Customs. They're the ones who collect the tariff on the point of import. What companies can do, once that law is in place, they have to comply with it, so they've got to pay the money over to the treasury. But what they can do is they can diversify. They don't necessarily need to be importing from that source country, so they can go and diversify their base and import goods from somewhere else,
Awesome.
or export goods elsewhere. So it's a two-way street. So it's about looking at those avenues, looking at free trade agreements, using the free trade agreements to the best of most of the benefit they can get out of those. So we've got Australia, we've got free trade agreements with Japan, US. Obviously, that's overridden by some of the tariffs that have come in, but we've got a free trade agreement with China, for example. And things have shifted. We've gone from a position with China where we had very high tariffs. Those tariffs have been rescinded now, have come back to normal. So we've got actually a very fruitful relationship with them. And we're looking into other avenues at the moment. So Australia is looking again at restarting negotiations for a free trade agreement with European Union, for example, which was stalled a couple of years ago.
Yeah, that's been long awaited for that one.
And you know, they're just examples. When we say diversify, we actually provide some examples, and that's a perfect scenario where if you were able to conclude that free trade agreement, that will open up avenues and doors to a lot of Australian companies to engage in trade that's actually free of tariff.
Is there a way you can avoid tariffs? Say, for instance, one country is hit with a higher tariff rate than Australia. Could they ship their product to Australia as a, safe harbor, so to speak, and then divert that product through Australia to the United States? Are there any loopholes in this whole trade war, tariff?
Yeah. Look, I probably wouldn't go as far as calling them loopholes, but there are some planning opportunities around, looking at the origin of where specific parts are made, how much of it is made in one country versus the other, where the goods are assembled. There are some planning opportunities that can potentially minimise the amount of tariff that one pays, and a good advisor will be able to navigate through that maze and advise what's possible and what's not. So there's no blanket exemptions, but there are some ways of optimising those outcomes.
And you talk about like supply chain disruptions. Can you go a little bit deeper into what does that mean, especially when you talk about the U.S.-China trade friction that can disrupt global supply chains in which Australia businesses participate? Australia being in the middle of that China-U.S. Trade negotiations, what does that mean? Does Australia have a stronger position, or are we just in the middle of all of this and just have to try to figure out how we navigate through both of our very strong trading partners?
Yeah, so first and foremost, Australia is a much smaller economy, and it's probably, we're not leading the way in setting these policies or putting these settings in place globally. So for us, any disruption to global trade, any downturn in economic activity at a global level is not good, because we tend to feel it first. We're a very export resource-oriented economy, and as soon as there's a slowdown in the with our key customers, China, India, and the like, then we essentially feel it. So prima facie, any disruption to global trade is probably a bad thing for Australia. So we would look to always, again, I'm probably going outside of my area of expertise, but we would look to even out any impacts that tariffs have. So our reactions initially, the government's reactions have been not to necessarily reciprocate measures with tariffs. So, but going to your supply chain question, disruptions in supply chains can have a ripple effect. As you know, if things stop, if the demand drops off, if things are no longer made or can't be made because of a high tariff or high input costs, which is a byproduct of a tariff, that can have a ripple effect on Australia, which means where all of a sudden the product that we used to import yesterday is no longer available, or is available at a much higher cost. So that does interrupt the way we do business here. So it's a multifaceted sort of matrix type approach, where I don't think it's a one size fits all. You really need to look at all different channels and continue to monitor until we get some stability in the market. Yeah.
Well, as long as they keep their hands off my Tim Tams, I'm okay. You know, as long as we don't increase those prices, because I'm a big fan of the Tim Tam,
Yeah.
right?
I need to have a look where that chocolate comes from, Donald. Yeah.
True.
Because
That's
I'm pretty sure they're made in Australia, still by Arnott's, but yeah, we just need to look at the price of chocolate has actually gone through the roof.
they have, you know.
So it might be, it might be something other than tariffs that's actually driving the cost of those Tim Tams.
Oh well, coffee and chocolate. That's problematic.
Yeah.
You know,
I mean, last time I looked at the block in Woolworths, it was up to about $9 or something, and then they discounted by 50%, and you're getting it for $4.50,
well,
which was the
we're back
original
to
price
exactly.
anyway, about a year ago. So
Well, I mean, it's just those small things that can really disrupt markets. You know, those small comforts that we have in our purchases, and you can see them creeping up in price, and it's real. You know, this trade war, the increase and you know the percentages and the tariffs, you can feel it. I mean, and when I was just back in the United States last month, and you can, you know, I'm talking to the Uber drivers and talking to folks that are helping to serve us, and everything's increased in price. You know, there was a point in America where you order a meal, and it was like one meal made for 2 or 3 people. Well, I mean, 2 or 3 people can eat that one. Now it's just the Australian-sized portions at exorbitant prices. So it's like you can feel that everyone is cutting back as opposed to what happened pre-Trump.
yeah, there's an interesting term that's used widely by the press called shrinkflation. So it's sort of shrinking size of products that we consume, and at the same time, passing the costs of price increases to the consumer. So it's not good for the consumer both ways. So when you get your packet of Tim Tams, you know, instead of 12, there's probably only 10 in there now. You probably haven't noticed, but keep an eye on that. But yeah, look, I guess, you know, to leave your viewers and followers with the right sort of message here is, you know, tariffs are going to be an impact if they really permanently filter through into Australian supply chains and globally on prices.
Yeah.
So certainly, you know, that we could see them being more inflationary than not. But I would be very quick to say that that's probably not the only reason prices are going. There's a number of other factors that we've seen emerge over the last couple of years that have created that inflationary cycle and have gotten into a place that we are now across, you know, the G20 economies. We've seen very similar patterns where, you know, your input costs across the board have gone up. So your energy costs, your raw material costs, and then other things that we need to acquire in order to produce something, and that's created. And also, I should probably add, you know, a lot of pent up demand following COVID, where people have, you know, sort of lived in this probably artificial setting for about 2 years, haven't really spent the money. Then, you know, when we finally opened the floodgates, people went out and spent a lot. So there was a lot of money in the economies, which is essentially inflationary. But again, you know, we're going off topic a little bit here into the economic side of things, which is hopefully is interesting for your viewers to hear as well.
Absolutely. I mean, I think, like you said, one of your key takeaways is to stay informed, and you keeping us informed on, you know, different trade developments, global trade developments, and even if it directly or indirectly has an effect on Australia, it's important to know these things because we're a more circular economy, global circular economy, and what normally happens in the U.S. or China could have a direct effect on Australia. As it relates to Felix Partners, what can you do to help one of our listeners or one of our clients understand this space a bit better and help them with their financial needs?
Yeah, look, it's a really good conversation opener, actually. And what we do is, I think it's a no. There's no one size fits all. So every company is going to be different because their channels of trade are different. They interact with different economies. They sell different products, and as discussed earlier, those products are always going to be subject to different rates of tariff or not, etc. So it's really understanding what they do first. That's the first step. And we actually offer a free strategy session to sit down, understand their exposure, understand their impact that they potentially have currently or they're likely to have in the future.
Wow.
And then it's methodically sitting down and planning with them to work through some of those opportunities that we highlight. So the free trade agreements, country of origin rules, diversification of trade, et cetera, et cetera. So there's probably a couple of different distinct avenues. It does get very granular and very technical when you start looking through some of those channels, in particular looking at tariff legislation and country of origin rules, free trade agreement rules. So that's when the conversations become probably a lot more involved. Having to look at rulings, legislation, all of that sort of stuff. But at a very high level, those would be the key opportunities that we put forward to clients.
Well, Sasha, I really appreciate you humanizing finance, because for a lot of folks, it's just a scary, it's a scary area. And by you coming on Financial Fridays to discuss finance in a humanizing way, in a way where we can just get it, that's appreciative. I appreciate that, and I'm sure our audience members appreciate that as well. So, we're looking forward to more of your takeouts and advice and key takeaways as it relates to finance. So, thank you for having us.
It's our pleasure, Donald.
Thank you.
Speak to you very soon.
Thank you, sir.